The schoolteacher realized why his old flame only visits during the fog.
You want the full experience? Then you need to check the link in the description. Period.
The heavy oak door of the schoolhouse groaned on its hinges, yielding to a frantic shove that sent a spray of rainwater across the freshly swept floorboards. Elodie stumbled into the room, her breath coming in ragged, whistling gasps that clouded in the chilly autumn air. Her chestnut hair, once kept in neat braids during their childhood, was now a wild tangle matted with crushed pine needles and droplets of gray sleet. She reached out to steady herself, her fingers grazing a wooden desk, but her strength failed. As she slumped against the heavy furniture, the small, velvet-covered antlers protruding from her hairline scraped against the chalkboard with a jarring, screeching sound. White dust puffed into the air, coating the dark tines of her horns as she sank toward the floor. She looked less like a woman, and more like a fragment of the woods that had somehow taken human shape, her rust-colored dress torn at the hem and soaked through by the relentless Oregon storm. In the small living quarters partitioned off at the back of the schoolroom, Perry was hunched over a stack of arithmetic papers. The sudden intrusion made him jump, and his hand jerked, sending a heavy glob of ink from his quill onto a student's perfect long division. He stood so abruptly that his spectacles slid down the bridge of his nose, dangling precariously as he hurried into the main classroom. He stopped dead in his tracks, the quill slipping from his ink-stained fingers to clatter unnoticed on the floor. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. At first, his mind struggled to categorize the figure huddled against the desks. He saw the elegant, furred limbs and the dainty hooves where feet should be, and a primal flash of fear sparked in his chest. However, as the figure lifted her head, the flickering light of the single oil lamp caught the depths of her eyes. The fear evaporated, replaced by a dizzying sense of displacement. Perry stared into those large, soulful, liquid brown eyes and felt the walls of the frontier schoolhouse melt away, replaced by the memories of a sun-drenched village green half a lifetime ago. The shape of her face and the gentle curve of her brow were unmistakable, preserved in the amber of his private thoughts for over a decade. It was Elodie, the baker's daughter who had wandered into the deep timber and never returned, leaving a hole in the community that had never truly closed. He took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke her name. He expected a phantom to vanish, but the creature before him shivered, her soft, deer-like ears twitching at the sound of his voice. She looked at his crisp white shirt and the ink on his hands, recognizing the boy who used to share his books with her. She tried to speak, but her throat seemed dry and tight. When the words finally came, they were soft and airy, carrying a quality like the rustling of dried leaves in a late October breeze. She whispered his name, the two syllables vibrating with a familiarity that bridged the years of her absence. Hearing her voice confirmed the impossible reality that this was no mere forest animal or mountain legend. She was his long-lost friend, returned from the shadows of the wilderness with the marks of the wild etched into her very bones. Perry felt a surge of protective heat wash over him, a fierce instinct that overrode his natural caution. He noticed then that she was favoring her right side, her slender leg tucked beneath the hem of her skirt in a way that suggested deep pain. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the rust-colored fabric of her dress, stark against the earthy tones of the wool. Perry's gaze shifted from her face to the wound, and then instinctively toward the windows where the fog pressed against the glass like a living shroud. He realized with a jolt of terror that if she was hurt and fleeing, she was being followed. He didn't waste another second. He lunged for the front door, throwing the heavy iron bolt into place with a resounding thud that echoed through the rafters. His mind raced with the implications of her presence. The townspeople were already wary of the strange shadows seen in the mist, and the school board, led by stern men like the local hunters, would have no mercy for a creature they deemed a trophy or a threat. He had worked so hard to earn their respect, but looking at Elodie, those ambitions felt suddenly hollow. He knelt beside her on the cold floor, reaching into his vest pocket to retrieve his only clean linen handkerchief. His hands trembled as he worked, but he forced himself to be steady. He gently lifted the hem of her skirt to reveal the injury, his breath catching at the sight of the jagged tear in her skin. As he began to bind the wound, his fingers brushing against the soft, short fur of her lower leg, Elodie leaned her head back against the desk and closed her eyes. She began to speak in hushed, broken sentences, explaining the transformation that had overtaken her. She spoke of the ancient, deep parts of the forest where the air tasted of old magic and the light fell differently. She described how the woods had claimed her, reshaping her form to match the spirit of the grove until she was no longer entirely of the human world. The intimacy of the moment was shattered by a sound that made Perry's blood run cold. From somewhere deep in the misty meadow beyond the schoolhouse fence, a chorus of baying hounds rose into the night air. It was followed by the faint, rhythmic thud of galloping horses and the muffled shouts of men calling out to one another. The hunt was up. Perry recognized the booming voice of the lead woodsman, a man who prided himself on clearing the valley of any predators that dared approach the livestock. The search party was moving with purpose, their lanterns likely swinging like angry fireflies through the gray haze. They were tracking the scent of blood, and that trail led directly to the door of the one-room schoolhouse. Perry looked at the locked door and then back at Elodie's pale, exhausted face. He could feel the vibrations of the approaching horses through the floorboards, a low drumming that signaled the end of his quiet, orderly life. If he opened that door and handed her over, his position in the town would be solidified forever as a hero who helped purge the woods. He would be the respected teacher he had always dreamed of being. But as Elodie reached out a trembling hand and touched the sleeve of his charcoal vest, her velvet antlers casting long, elegant shadows against the wall, Perry knew that choice was already made. He couldn't let them take her. The ink on his fingers felt like a brand of his humanity, a reminder of the civilized world he was about to defy for the sake of a girl who had returned from a fairy tale. He stood up, his mind spinning as he searched for a way to hide her before the first lantern light hit the window. The urgent hammering at the front door vibrated through the wooden frame, making the glass panes rattle in their leaden casings. Perry felt a jolt of pure adrenaline, his heart leaping into his throat as he scanned the small classroom for a sanctuary. He grabbed Elodie by her slender, trembling shoulders and guided her toward the back of the room, where a heavy wool curtain partitioned off his modest living quarters. His fingers brushed the rust-colored fabric of her dress, noting how her breath came in short, panicked hitches that puffed against his neck. He ushered her into the cramped space, which held only a narrow iron cot and a washstand, and gestured frantically for her to remain silent. She huddled on the floorboards, her velvet antlers disappearing behind the thick fabric just as the latch on the front door began to strain under a heavy hand. Perry took a deep breath, adjusted his spectacles, and turned to face the intrusion. He pulled the bolt back with a sharp metallic scrape, and the door swung inward to reveal Sharon and Linda standing on the porch. The damp night air rushed in, smelling of wet cedar and churned earth. Sharon, the formidable head of the school board, stood with her arms crossed over her heavy wool shawl, her expression carved from the same granite as the Oregon hills. Beside her, Linda held a swinging lantern that cast long, erratic shadows across the desks, her eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and suspicion. Sharon did not wait for an invitation, stepping over the threshold with a heavy tread that seemed to demand an account of every shadow in the room. She looked Perry up and down, her gaze lingering on his disheveled hair and the frantic energy radiating from his lean frame. The school board leader wasted no time with pleasantries, her voice cutting through the quiet of the room like a jagged blade. She demanded to know if the beast had been seen, claiming a group of hunters had tracked a large, wounded animal right to the edge of the schoolyard. Perry felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, but he forced his features into a mask of confused innocence. He adjusted his black string tie, his ink-stained fingers fumbling slightly with the silk. He told her he had heard a commotion in the brush earlier, perhaps a stray deer or a mountain lion, but that he had been far too occupied with the grading of his students' examinations to investigate further. He spoke with a measured, scholarly tone, trying to leverage the very reputation for seriousness that he had worked so hard to build since arriving in the territory. Linda, however, was not so easily distracted, and she began to pace the perimeter of the room with her lantern held low. The yellow light swept across the floor, illuminating the grain of the wood and the dust motes dancing in the air. Suddenly, she stopped near the front row of desks, the light pooling around a dark, glistening smudge on the floorboards. She pointed a gloved finger at the spot, her voice rising in a sharp trill as she noted the presence of fresh blood. Perry's stomach did a slow, sickening roll, but his mind moved with the speed of a cornered fox. He reached for a heavy stack of geography books resting on a nearby table and let them slip from his grasp. The thick volumes hit the floor with a resounding boom, landing squarely over the crimson stain and sending a small cloud of chalk dust into the air. He offered a sheepish, apologetic smile, claiming that he had been quite clumsy this evening due to the flickering lamplight and the weight of his responsibilities. He maintained his composure even as Sharon leaned in closer, her eyes searching his face for any sign of a lie. He insisted that he was merely a man of letters, unaccustomed to the wild alarms of the frontier, and suggested that perhaps the hunters should check the old barn down the road instead. Sharon huffed, her breath visible in the chilly air of the schoolroom, and finally gestured for Linda to follow her back out into the mist. She warned him to keep his doors barred, stating that the men were gathering at the general store to coordinate a final sweep of the woods before the fog became too thick to navigate. The moment the door clicked shut, and the sound of their retreating footsteps faded into the distance, Perry collapsed against the wood, his knees feeling like water. He waited until the orange glow of their lantern vanished into the gray soup of the night before he dared to move. He hurried back to the curtain partition and pulled it aside, finding Elodie sitting on the edge of his small cot. She wasn't hiding in fear. Instead, she was holding one of his leather-bound volumes, her delicate fingers tracing the embossed gold lettering on the spine. The sight of her there, a creature of myth surrounded by the tools of his trade, struck a chord of profound nostalgia in his chest. He realized that even in this strange, altered state, the curious girl who loved stories was still very much alive within her. He sat on a low wooden stool across from her, the silence between them filled with the unspoken weight of 10 years. He began to tell her about his journey, his voice low and rhythmic as he described the long years of study and the quiet desperation that had driven him to become a teacher. He confessed that his primary motivation for taking this post in such a remote, rain-swept corner of the world was the faint, irrational hope of finding a way back to these woods. He had never truly accepted that she was gone, and he had spent his youth looking for her in every shadow and every line of poetry he read. Elodie listened with her head tilted, her large ears twitching as she absorbed the cadence of his words, her liquid eyes reflecting the soft light of the single candle on his washstand. As he finished speaking, Elodie reached out a slender hand, her palm soft and warm against his cheek. Her fingers transitioned into a fine, dark texture near the tips, and she used a gentle hoof hand to lift his spectacles, sliding them back up the bridge of his nose where they belonged. She marveled at the change in him, whispering that the clumsy, ink-spattered boy she remembered had grown into a serious man of great purpose. The touch was light, but it sent a jolt of electricity through Perry's frame, grounding him in the reality of their connection. For a moment, the danger outside seemed a world away, replaced by the warmth of a shared history that refused to be erased by time or transformation. He felt a fierce resolve harden within him. He was no longer just a schoolteacher, but a guardian of something ancient and precious. The moment of peace was fleeting, as a heavy bank of fog rolled against the window, turning the glass into an opaque wall of white. Perry looked toward the darkness, his mind working through the logistics of their situation. He knew that the hunters would not stay at the general store for long, and once they realized the trail ended at the schoolhouse, they would return with more than just questions. He couldn't keep her hidden in a partitioned corner forever. the school board would eventually demand an inspection of the entire building. He needed a plan to move her through the woods to the deep, hidden valley she had described, a place where the townspeople feared to tread. The realization hit him like a physical weight that he was about to risk everything he had built for a woman the world would call a monster. He stood up and paced the small space, his boots creaking on the floorboards as he weighed his options. The fog was both a blessing and a curse, providing cover but also making the treacherous forest paths nearly impossible to navigate without a guide. He looked at Elodie, who was now watching him with a mixture of trust and sorrow, her velvet antlers catching the dim light. He knew that by helping her, he would become an outcast in the very community he had sought to lead, but as he looked at her soulful eyes, the choice didn't feel like a sacrifice at all. It felt like the only honest thing he had done in years. He reached for his heavy wool coat, his mind set on the path ahead, knowing that the next few hours would decide both of their fates. The heavy latch rattled again, and Perry's heart hammered against his ribs as he recognized the rhythm of the knock. It was hesitant but persistent, a sharp contrast to the aggressive pounding from earlier. He signaled for Elodie to remain perfectly still behind the heavy wool curtain, then smoothed his vest and opened the door a crack. Linda stood there alone, the mist clinging to her bonnet like a shroud of tiny diamonds. She held a ceramic dish wrapped in a checkered cloth, the aroma of spiced meat and baked crust wafting into the chilly room. She offered a small, tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, which were darting past his shoulder to scan the shadows of the classroom. She claimed she had brought him a warm meat pie to settle his nerves, insisting that a bachelor living alone surely lacked a proper meal on such a harrowing night. As she stepped inside without an explicit invitation, her boots clicked rhythmically on the floorboards, and she began a slow, deliberate circuit of the room. She paused by the chalkboard, her fingers trailing through the white dust as she spoke about the growing unrest in the village. She mentioned that the men had gathered by the well and found deep, cloven impressions in the mud leading directly to the schoolhouse porch before the fog had swallowed the trail. Her voice was low and melodic, yet it carried an undercurrent of steel that made Perry's skin prickle. She watched his reaction closely, nodding the way he gripped the back of a student's chair until his knuckles turned the color of parchment. It was a calculated interrogation disguised as neighborly concern, a test to see if the new schoolmaster was a man of the community or a protector of the unknown. Linda leaned against the heavy oak desk, her gaze lingering on the partitioned corner where the curtain swayed ever so slightly in the draft. She remarked that the town viewed his outsider status with a certain degree of skepticism, and that his career was currently balanced on a very thin edge. To harbor a threat to the livestock and the safety of the children would be seen as a betrayal that no amount of scholarship could mend. She warned him that the hunters were not merely looking for a predator. They were looking for a scapegoat for the poor harvest and the strange sightings that had plagued the valley all season. If he wanted to keep his position and the respect of the board, he would need to be the one to raise the alarm when the search parties returned at the first light of dawn. Once the door finally clicked shut behind her, the silence that followed felt heavy and suffocating. Perry didn't move for a long time, listening to the fading crunch of her footsteps on the gravel path. Elodie emerged from behind the wool partition, her movements fluid and silent, her hooves making no more sound than a falling leaf. She looked toward the window where the white vapor pressed against the glass, her expression one of profound weariness rather than fear. She spoke in a voice that sounded like the rustle of dry grass, confessing that she only dared to approach the schoolhouse when the fog was thick enough to act as a veil. She had learned the patterns of the townspeople, the timing of the patrols, and the exact moment the lanterns were extinguished in the valley. She reached into the pocket of her rust-colored dress and produced a small, withered bouquet of dried larkspur and wild sage. Perry felt a lump form in his throat as she explained that she had been watching him from the safety of the tree line for weeks. Those small bundles of wildflowers he had found resting on the cedar stump outside each morning had not been the work of a shy student or a secret admirer among the village women. They were her way of reaching out to him across the chasm of her transformation, a silent reminder of the girl who used to braid clover chains in the meadows behind the bakery. She had seen him through the glass, hunched over his books and rubbing his tired eyes, and she had waited for a night like this to finally bridge the distance between them. The weight of her admission settled over Perry, bringing with it a sharp, cold realization about the people he served. To the school board and the farmers, Elodie was not a lost soul or a childhood friend. She was a curse, a blight upon the land that needed to be purged to ensure the survival of their crops and their way of life. They didn't see the intelligence in her liquid brown eyes or the gentleness in the way she handled his books. To them, she was a trophy to be hung or a monster to be driven into the earth. The superstition of the frontier was a powerful, jagged thing, and he understood now that there was no middle ground to be found. He could not be the respectable schoolmaster and her protector at the same time. A desperate plan began to take shape in his mind, born of the ink-stained logic of a man who knew the value of a distraction. He knew where the school board kept the surplus oil for the street lamps and the search lanterns, stored in a locked shed behind the general store. If he could slip out under the cover of the deepening mist, he could replace the fuel with water from the well. When the men gathered at dawn to begin their sweep, their flames would sputter and die, leaving them blind in the thickest part of the morning gray. It would create a narrow window of opportunity, a few precious minutes of confusion that would allow Elodie to slip past the perimeter and reach the safety of the high ridges where the horses could not follow. The emotional gravity of the decision anchored him to the spot, his breath coming in slow, deliberate draws. By sabotaging the hunt, he was effectively ending his life in this town before it had truly begun. He would lose the modest room, the steady salary, and the reputation he had spent a decade of hard study to earn. He would be branded a traitor to his kind, a man who chose the company of shadows over the light of civilization. Yet as he looked at Elodie, her soft ears twitching at the distant sound of a barking dog, he realized that his home wasn't a building or a title. It was the connection they had forged in the damp Oregon woods so many years ago, a bond that had survived the most impossible of changes. He moved to his small washstand and began to gather the supplies he would need, his hands steady despite the chaos of his thoughts. He found a tin funnel and a heavy canvas bag, his mind already calculating the distance to the storage shed and the timing of the guards' rounds. Elodie watched him with a mixture of awe and concern, her delicate hand reaching out to touch the rough wool of his sleeve as if to ground him. He turned to her, his spectacles slipping down his nose as he offered a small, determined smile. He told her to stay away from the windows and to be ready to move the moment he returned. The schoolroom, once a place of order and predictable lessons, had become the staging ground for a quiet revolution. Outside, the world was a silent expanse of gray and silver, the fog dampening the sounds of the night and turning the familiar schoolyard into an alien landscape. Perry stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at his skin and the smell of wet pine filling his lungs. He looked back one last time at the warm glow of the candle flickering in the window, knowing that he might never see this room again as its master. The transition from a man of letters to a man of action felt like a physical shedding of skin. He vanished into the mist, his dark trousers blending into the shadows as he set off toward the village, a solitary figure navigating the treacherous path between duty and a love that refused to die. The morning arrived not with a golden glow, but with a suffocating blanket of charcoal vapor that clung to the damp timber of the schoolhouse. Sharon stood on the top step, her face a mask of stern resolve as she addressed the group of men gathered in the yard. She held a heavy iron-sighted rifle, its barrel glinting with condensation, and her voice carried a sharp authority that brooked no dissent. Perry stood at the periphery of the group, his fingers trembling as he adjusted his spectacles against the biting chill. He felt the rough grain of a borrowed firearm being shoved into his palms, the cold metal biting into his skin. Sharon looked him directly in the eye, her gaze a silent challenge to prove his loyalty to the town. He He forced himself to nod, the weight of the weapon feeling like a leaden anchor as he joined the ranks of the hunters. High above the gathered crowd, tucked into the narrow rafters where the shadows were deepest, Elodie watched through a crack in the ceiling boards. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, the sound loud in her own ears as she observed the scene below. She could see the top of Perry's head, his dark hair damp with the mist, surrounded by men carrying torches and lengths of rope. The sight of him holding a rifle sent a jolt of cold terror through her limbs, though she saw the way his knuckles were white with tension. She remained motionless, her small antlers tucked close to the rafters, praying that the scent of the old cedar and dust would mask her presence from the hounds packing restlessly on their leashes. The atmosphere turned frantic when Sharon suddenly gestured toward the open schoolroom door, commanding a final sweep of the building before they set out into the trees. Perry felt a surge of panic, his mind racing to find a way to redirect their focus. He stepped forward, his voice cracking slightly as he claimed he had seen a large, dark shape darting toward the southern ridge just moments before they arrived. He pointed toward the jagged rocks that overlooked the valley, insisting that the tracks he had noticed earlier were fresh and heading away from the village. His heart thundered as he watched Sharon hesitate, her eyes scanning the schoolhouse interior with lingering suspicion, before she finally signaled the men to follow his lead. To solidify the deception, Perry moved toward the muddy edge of the schoolyard, surreptitiously dragging a heavy, discarded rug he had pulled from the porch. He moved with a feigned sense of urgency, creating a deep, singular furrow in the soft earth that mimicked the heavy stride of a large creature. He led the group toward the treacherous rocky cliffs, the sound of the men's heavy boots and the baying of the dogs filling the air. Every step away from the schoolhouse was a breath of life for Elodie, but the guilt of his lie sat heavy in his stomach. He focused on the uneven ground, his eyes fixed on the gray horizon, trying to ignore the way the villagers whispered about the bounty that awaited the one who brought the beast down. Linda walked close to his side, her stride rhythmic and predatory as she watched his every move. She leaned in, her voice a low hiss that barely carried over the sound of the wind, nodding that his hands were shaking more than a man should during a simple hunt. She reminded him that Sharon had a keen eye for deception, and that the town had little patience for those who played both sides of a conflict. Her warning was a cold blade of reality, a reminder that his position was more precarious than ever. Perry didn't answer, instead focusing on the way his boots sank into the mire, his mind a whirlwind of calculations. He knew that if they reached the cliffs and found nothing, the suspicion would turn entirely upon him. The progress of the hunting party slowed to a crawl as the men attempted to light their lanterns against the encroaching gloom. Perry watched with a hidden sense of triumph as the first hunter struck a match, only for the flame to sputter and die in a hiss of steam. One by one, the men grumbled and cursed, shaking their brass lanterns and finding the fuel inside contaminated with water. The heavy moisture in the air made the task impossible, leaving them with only the dim, filtered light of the morning to guide their way. Sharon's face twisted in frustration as she barked orders for more matches, but the dampness had seeped into everything, turning their primary advantage into a useless weight of glass and metal. The frustration boiled over into a heated argument between Sharon and the lead tracker, a grizzled man who insisted the trail Perry had pointed out was nothing more than a trick of the light. They stood in a circle near a cluster of stunted pines, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusations and demands. The tracker pointed back toward the schoolhouse, his instincts telling him they were being led on a fool's errand, while Sharon refused to admit her judgment had been flawed. The men began to bicker among themselves, the unity of the hunt dissolving into a mess of bruised egos and cold limbs. It was the moment of chaos Perry had been waiting for, the perfect distraction to mask his own movements. He began to back away slowly, his movements deliberate and quiet as he retreated into the thickest part of the fog. He waited until the silhouettes of the hunters were nothing more than blurred shapes in the gray before he turned and broke into a silent run. His lungs burned with the cold air, and his spectacles threatened to fly off his face. But he didn't slow down until the sounds of the arguing men were muffled by the dense timber. He navigated by memory, the familiar landmarks of the trail appearing and vanishing like ghosts in the mist. He had to reach Elodie before the tracker convinced Sharon to double back, knowing that the window of safety he had created was closing with every passing second. The schoolhouse loomed out of the white vapor like a shipwreck, silent and expectant. Perry didn't stop to catch his breath, his boots thudding softly on the wooden porch as he burst through the door. He found Elodie standing in the center of the room, her eyes wide and luminous in the dim light, her rust-colored dress a sharp contrast to the drab interior. She didn't speak, but the relief in her expression was palpable as she stepped toward him. He gripped her hand, his fingers finding hers in the shadows, and felt the frantic pulse in her wrist. There was no time for explanations or comfort. The hunt was still active, and the village was no longer a place of sanctuary for either of them. He began to gather a few essential items, a heavy wool cloak, a small bag of dried rations, and a canteen of water, tossing them into a pack with frantic energy. He told her they had to move toward the high ridges immediately, before the sun burned away the fog and left them exposed on the open slopes. Elodie nodded, her ears twitching as she listened to the distant, muffled shouts of the men still arguing near the cliffs. She seemed to understand the gravity of what he was doing, the way he was casting aside his books and his career for a life in the shadows. She reached out, her palm resting briefly against his cheek, a gesture of profound gratitude that stilled his racing heart for a single, quiet heartbeat. They slipped out the back door, staying close to the side of the building where the eaves provided a small measure of cover. The world felt vast and dangerous, a landscape of hidden threats and shifting boundaries. Perry led the way, his knowledge of the local geography proving more valuable than any lesson he had ever taught. He chose the paths that were overgrown and neglected, the ones that the hunters would avoid in favor of the main trails. As they moved deeper into the woods, the schoolhouse vanished behind them, swallowed by the same mist that had brought Elodie back to him. The transition was complete. The teacher had become a fugitive, guided by a love that the world below could never comprehend. The damp earth yielded beneath Perry's boots as he sprinted across the rear clearing, his lungs drawing in the sharp, pine-scented air of the Oregon frontier. He reached the back window of the schoolhouse, where the glass was clouded with condensation and the silver light of the morning. Elodie was already there, her silhouette a dark, graceful shape against the pale wood of the interior frame. She slid the sash upward with a muted creak, her large, liquid-brown eyes searching his face for any sign of the men he had led away. He reached out, his ink-stained fingers catching her smaller, delicate hand to help her navigate the ledge. Her hooves made a soft, rhythmic clicking sound against the floorboards as she stepped out into the tall grass, her rust-colored dress fluttering in the breeze. They didn't speak, the urgency of the moment far beyond the need for words, and together they plunged into the swirling white veil that swallowed the edge of the schoolyard. They moved with a frantic rhythm toward the meadow where the mist hung heaviest, a sea of gray that promised a temporary shroud from their pursuers. The ground was uneven, tangled with blackberry vines and hidden roots that threatened to trip Perry at every turn, yet Elodie moved with an innate, ethereal fluidness. Her ears twitched, rotating toward the distant sound of a snapping branch or a muffled shout, her instincts sharp and heightened. Just as the forest began to thicken into a wall of ancient cedar, a tall, imposing figure materialized from the haze directly in their path. Sharon stood there, her jaw set in a hard line of grim determination, her knuckles white as she gripped a recurve bow. She had anticipated his gambit, circling back through the thicket while the others followed the false trail toward the cliffs, and now she stood with an arrow notched and leveled at Elodie's chest. The sight of the feathered fletching aimed at the woman he loved sparked a cold, crystalline clarity in Perry's mind that he had never known before. Without a second of hesitation, he stepped forward, planting his feet firmly in the mud and shielding Elodie with his own body. He felt the warmth of her breath against the back of his neck and the slight tremble of her velvet antlers near his shoulder, but he did not flinch. He stared directly into Sharon's eyes, his spectacles sliding down the bridge of his nose as he spoke with a voice that held no tremor. He told her that the forest spirits were not the enemies of the town, and that the real darkness lived in the hearts of those who hunted what they did not understand. He declared that if she intended to spill blood this morning, she would have to start with the man who had taught her own children their letters. Sharon's fingers remained taut on the bowstring, the tension in the air so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing against them. She looked at Perry, seeing not the nervous, bumbling academic she had hired months ago, but a man who had found a core of iron beneath his charcoal vest. Her gaze shifted to Elodie, who peered over Perry's shoulder with an expression of profound sorrow rather than malice, her white-spotted shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. The silence of the woods seemed to amplify the moral weight of the choice before the school board member. Slowly, the lethal angle of the bow began to dip toward the mossy ground. Sharon's shoulders slumped, the fire of the hunt extinguished by the raw evidence of a bond that transcended the superstitions of the valley. She realized that the beast she sought was a woman who loved and was loved in return. The bowstring went slack as Sharon reached up to rub a hand over her tired eyes, a long sigh escaping her lips. She told them to run, her voice a low, rough rasp that barely carried through the fog, and warned them never to show their faces in this part of the territory again. She promised to return to the village and tell the hunters that the creature had leaped into the great divide, vanishing into the depths where no human could ever hope to follow. It was a lie that would cost her prestige, but it was a gift of life she was finally willing to give. Perry felt a surge of gratitude that nearly brought him to his knees, but he simply nodded once, a silent pact sealed between the law of the town and the truth of the wild. Sharon turned back toward the village, her figure slowly dissolving into the gray until she was nothing more than a memory. Perry turned to look at the schoolhouse one last time, seeing it as a cage he was finally leaving behind. He reached up and pulled his spectacles from his face, the world turning into a soft, impressionistic blur that matched the dreamlike quality of the forest. He unbuttoned his charcoal wool vest, the heavy fabric falling to the damp earth alongside his glasses, shedding the identity of the schoolteacher like a brittle snakeskin. He didn't need the clarity of glass or the prestige of a vest to see the path ahead of him. He looked at Elodie, whose soulful eyes were now bright with a flickering hope, and he saw a future that no textbook could ever describe. He was no longer a man of ink and parchment. He was a man of the mist, ready to trade the safety of a wooden room for the vast, unpredictable freedom of the heights. They began the long ascent, climbing toward the hidden sanctuary deep within the ancient pines where the fog never lifted. The air grew colder and thinner, the scent of damp earth replaced by the sharp, clean aroma of high-altitude needles and old stone. Here, the world felt timeless, a place where the reaching branches of the trees formed a ceiling far grander than any schoolhouse rafters. Elodie led the way now, her hooves finding purchase on the slick rocks with a confidence that Perry mirrored as he scrambled after her. He felt a strange, soaring lightness in his chest, the heavy burden of the village's expectations falling away with every foot of elevation they gained. The hunters could not follow them here, for the mountain held its secrets close, and the mist acted as a guardian for those who knew how to walk within its embrace. As they reached a high ridge overlooking the valley, the sun began to peek through the clouds, casting long, golden shafts of light that turned the fog into a shimmering sea of opal. Perry reached out and took Elodie's hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, feeling the warmth of her skin and the steady, calm beat of her heart. They stood at the edge of a new world, one where they were no longer a teacher and a fugitive, but simply two souls who had found their way back to one another against all odds. They turned away from the valley and the distant, tiny shapes of the houses below, walking side by side into the deep shadows of the timber. Their footsteps left no lasting mark on the ancient forest floor, and as the mist closed in behind them, they disappeared into the wild, finally free to rediscover a love that had waited 10 years to bloom.